So where eye accessing cues come in is it is essentially a way of finding out whether a person is inside their mind making pictures or experiencing movies, whether they are hearing sounds, whether they are talking to themselves inside their minds, or whether they're experiencing feelings as well. This is very, very useful because, again, like I said, the more that you know about what's going on inside someone's mind, the more influence that you can have in that situation, the more rapport you can have, and also the more that you will understand where that person is coming from. So there are 6 different positions on the eye accessing cues chart. First of all, generally speaking, by the way, when someone looks up as you're looking at them, usually that means that they're searching for a picture because they have to access the visual cortex of their brain. So when you see someone looking up, it's not that they're ignoring you, it's because they have to go up to retrieve a picture or some kind of internal movie inside their mind. Now, if they go up to the right, and this is as you look at the person, then usually what it means is they are remembering something that has happened to them. For example, if we were to ask this guy here to remember what his front door looked like, because he has seen his front door before, he would have to go up and to the right to visually remember something that he's experienced in his past, and then bring the image down and then tell you about it. So his eyes would go up to the right into what we call visually remembered. That's R for remembered. However, if we were to ask him to think of a time that he had pink hair, now assuming that he's never had pink hair, then he would have to construct or create this image inside his mind, and his eyes would go up to the left into what we call visually constructed. And again, this is always as you look at the person. Now, if we were to ask him to remember his favourite song, obviously he's remembered this, he's heard this song before, so he would have to remember this song inside his mind. So his eyes would go straight across to the right into what we call auditory remembered. So that's A with R for auditory remembered. However, if we were to ask him to play this song inside his mind backwards, again assuming that he's never heard the song backwards, then he would have to go inside his mind and construct this song or create this song backwards, or what his representation of what that song playing backwards would be. And his eyes would go straight across to the left into what we call auditory construct. Now, if we were to ask him to have an internal conversation to himself, so say we said to him, okay, I want you to go inside and count from 1 to 10. His eyes would go down and to the right into what we call auditory internal dialogue. And that's essentially where we go inside and we have an internal conversation with ourselves, as most of us do quite a lot of the time during the day. So his eyes would go down and to the right as you look at him into what we call auditory internal dialogue. Now finally, if we were to ask him, okay, I want you to go inside and remember a time where you had a really good laugh, a time where you couldn't stop laughing, and remember what it actually felt like inside your stomach. Now in order to access these feelings, his eyes would have to go down and to the left as you look at him into what's called kinesthetic, or feelings. Now here's the thing. Even though this model has a certain amount of universality about it, it's not always the case. Sometimes this is reversed. Usually if a person is left-handed, and everything on the left will be in the right and everything on the right will be in the left, just to complicate things. And sometimes it'll be a lot more subtle than what you think. Some people are very obvious about these things. They'll even move their neck, they'll even move their head when they visualize. But some people are very, very subtle, and it's not quite as obvious to make out. The key to this is to use your observation skills and to do what we call calibrate, and to ask them a few simple questions first of all, and begin to notice where their eyes go and then begin to say, okay, their eyes go up to the right when they do that, so that means that that's visually remembered for them, based on the question that you've asked them. So you want to calibrate first, and then use that information to come up with some kind of pattern, some kind of model for that person. But use this as a basis as you're doing it. Okay, so a really good exercise to do is to pick a partner, or you can do this without the person knowing. You can go up and start speaking to them and begin to ask them some questions. If you look in the handout, you'll find an example of some of these questions. And then as you ask them, just pay attention to what happens to their eyes as they access the information. A really good thing to do is to memorize the questions first, then ask it, because sometimes it happens very quickly. So if you look down and ask the questions, by the time you look up, you'll have missed the actual eye accessing cue. So go ahead and do this, and then switch roles. If you're just doing this on an everyday basis, then just casually ask a person a question. You can say, oh yeah, what did you do last night? And then see where their eyes go. Most of the time it will be up to the right, because that's visually remembered. They may even have a feeling about that particular experience, so they might go up to visually remembered and then down to kinesthetic. Have fun with this, explore, and I'm sure you'll find it a very interesting experiment, a very interesting exercise. Okay, so we've talked about how the mind works in a fantastic way, that it takes in everything through the five senses: sight, sound, taste, touch and smell. But if we were to be consciously aware of all these things at the one time, it would just be overwhelming to us. So what it does is it filters this information down to manageable chunks. And that the three main representational systems that we have are visual, or sight, auditory, or the common name is sound, or kinesthetic, which is really just feelings and touch. Now, the thing is, what generally happens is, as we grow up throughout our lives, we begin to build a preference as to which of these representational systems that we use the most and we use first. Now, when I say preference, what I mean is, say for example, if you were right-handed, you would still use your left hand, wouldn't you? You would just go to your right hand first, and you would probably use it more often. So when I say preference, what I mean is, every single person has some capabilities of visualizing. Every single person has some capabilities of hearing sounds, of using their auditory representational system. And every person is aware that they experience feelings. Obviously, some people more than others. But you will have a preference. You will have one that you will do most of all, and one that you'll generally go to first as well. Now, what you tend to find is that there are certain characteristics that set out people who are visual. There are certain characteristics for people who are auditory, for an auditory preference, and there are certain characteristics of a person who has a kinesthetic preference as well. For example, visual people, and this is a gross generalization, but it's useful to use as a model, and then you can be a bit more accurate when you're actually in the moment talking with someone. But someone who has a visual preference tends to stand a bit more upright than normal. They tend to be quite upright. They breathe higher up in their chest. They will use lots of hand gestures because they're explaining the pictures inside their minds. And they will speak fairly fast as well because they have lots of pictures to explain. So there's lots of sensory data inside that they're attempting to explain to the outside world. Also, they will use very visual sounding words. For example, they'll use things like, well, that appears right to me. I just want to get some perspective on this. I think you're being a little bit short-sighted here. I'd like to see you again at some stage, but I think I've got tunnel vision here. So they tend to use words and phrases that have some kind of visual connotation to them. And that tells you that they're communicating predominantly through the visual sense. So that's visual people. Then we have people who have an auditory preference. Now these people are a little bit different. They tend to use less gestures. they tend to speak a little bit slower, they breathe lower down, and they use more auditory sounding words, like, for example, does that ring a bell to you? Is this loud and clear? I'll speak to you later, but, please hold your tongue. They'll say words that have some kind of auditory connotation to them. And again, that shows that they are speaking more from the auditory representational system than any other one.